Thank you, Scott. And good evening, everybody. Welcome. So glad to be here again this week. These topics I always kind of develop organically just from what's going on. And lately at the unit in LA, we've been having a lot of talk about shame. And that's, of course, not unusual. Shame is a big traveler along with addiction. It goes with it hand in hand. So I want to just talk about shame a little bit and ways to overcome shame, because I think that's a really essential feature of recovery, especially early recovery. So what is shame? You know, there's a couple of quotes, one by Carl Jung, who I really love, Carl Jung. But anyway, he says, shame is a soul-eating emotion. And I think anybody who's really been down that shame spiral can testify that it's a very unpleasant experience and can indeed be soul-eating. Brene Brown, who I also like, says the difference between shame and guilt is the difference between I am bad and I did something bad. And that really summarizes, I think, the essence of shame, which is not about something we did, but about actually who we are, about our core. This feeling that somehow I am flawed. Not that I did something wrong, but there's something terribly wrong with me. That our self-esteem withers, and we can drop into the shame spiral that we talk about, where people just drop into this kind of the depths of really feeling bad about themselves because of shame. You know, the one phrase I hear from clients and have heard from clients for 20 years is, I feel like damaged goods. And that, I think, captures that perfectly to me. There's something just, I'm so wrong. Who would ever want me? Who would, what good am I? You know, taking up space on the earth. So a couple of things to talk about how to really start to challenge shame. One is to really go back and figure out, and this I'd advise this with a therapist, to go back and sort of see what are the roots of this shame. You know, no child is ever born with shame. Shame is taught to us, and it's taught to us by our parents or by bullies at school or by the church or by laws, but it's all given to us. And kids, just the way they're wired, aren't able to refute it. They take it in, they take responsibility for it, they own it. And so before we even know it hit us, many of us have accumulated all this shame that was really kind of imposed on us. It was taught to us, and therefore it can be untaught. And I think part of the healing process and the recovery process can be going back and really looking at some of the old core beliefs I may have learned that were not true. You know, that I was unlovable, or that I'm unsafe, or that I'm somehow flawed. You know, kids just accept that if they're told that, or if they observe that, they take it in. So really going back and changing some of those things. Or if I have a core belief that I'm unsafe or I'm unlovable, that may transfer into behaviors that say, well, I'm never going to trust anybody, or I'm never going to be vulnerable. And those things directly impact our ability to connect as adults, to form healthy relationships. So these are old things that kind of really do have an impact through the course of our lives. And I think with trauma therapy, we can go back and sort of start to rework some of that and basically release some of that shame that never belonged to us in the first place. And that's I just described that process in 30 seconds. It takes a little bit of time to do that therapeutically, but it is really, really worth the effort. And what we know quite clearly is that those kind of traumatic experiences and those mistaken core beliefs about ourselves and mistaken behavioral decisions about I'll never trust anybody, or I'm on my own, or whatever those might be, that can be resolved with therapy. It does take time, but we know that those underlie almost all addictions. That's really the essence and the root of addictive behavior, no matter what it sprouts into. It could be, alcohol or opiates or sex or porn or gambling, or all of the above. But shame really is the core feature of that. Second thing I'd recommend is to recognize our shame triggers. What does that mean? So when you start to feel shame, freeze frame, stop, and go back. What just happened? You know, what thought just came through your mind? What old belief about yourself might have been triggered? How do you react to things, to certain comments? If people are shaming, or if people say hurtful things, or if people even give you, this is the weird thing about this, somebody can give you a compliment or say, God, you did a great job with that. But if I'm full of shame and don't believe I'm even worthy of doing that, I won't believe it. You know, we can sit around in a group and people can give wonderful affirming responses to a group member, but if that group member doesn't believe that it's possible, it rings hollow. They don't believe it. And so it's an inside job in many ways. You have to go inside and really, really work on that. And there's a technique that therapists use called the observer self. And I think it's an ability that comes right from our prefrontal cortex. It's human beings have this ability to step out of ourselves and to really look back and see ourselves and observe ourselves, say, wow, what's happened? When this happens, then I feel this way, or when that happens, I do that. And we start to put together these kind of the maps of our behaviors and start to kind of deconstruct some of the bad triggers we have. A third one, and this is tough. I mentioned that sometimes people have a hard time taking in compliments or taking in kind words about themselves. So the third one is to really practice some self-compassion. You know, if somebody's walking around thinking, you know, I am damaged goods, I am a worthless human being, and they believe that, it's going to be really hard to start to get compassion for themselves. And I think we really have to, I really like the idea of looking at our inner child or parts of ourselves that are young, these younger, wounded, damaged parts of ourselves that were hurt by others. And I think if we can have compassion for that part of ourselves, we may not be able to summon the compassion to feel good about all of us now, if we really believe that we are full of or damaged goods somehow or not worthy, but we might be able to feel some compassion for that younger part of ourselves that really walked into this situation or was born into this situation and had no choice about what happened to him or her. And so I think to really start to practice that compassion, and I believe that self-compassion is the antidote to shame. If there's one thing that kind of melts it away, I think that idea of self-compassion, sending some loving vibes toward that part of ourselves that we feel so bad about ourselves. And as with all behavior change, this is something where we have to start doing it before the belief will follow, right? The old program slogan, now act as if. We can't think our way through this and then the behavior changes. We have to change the behavior and then it starts to make sense to us. So at first it's going to seem weird. And it's like, why am I doing this? It's not working. Give it a chance. Challenge those thoughts. You know, once you start to identify what are these triggers that trigger me for shame, we can have what I call looping thoughts. These triggers that have given us shame in the past, that we do it to ourselves. We're constantly revisiting situations. It's like when you have a problem with your tooth, you know, your tongue just kind of goes there. You can't stop feeling that broken tooth with your tongue. In the same way, we kind of go toward these shameful events in our lives. We revisit them over and over again and kind of rev up the shame levels within us. So we have to really weaken the grasp that shame has on us and really challenge some of those negative beliefs about ourselves and really work on that. And that, as I said before, that is going to take time and practice, but that self-talk that we've talked about here before, that little critical voice in our ear, we really have to challenge that and refute that and say, no, just shut up, turn it down, and really step in and kind of bring reality to that. Couple more really quickly. Avoid your shame, what I call shame reinforcers. You know, there may be people in your life, and it may be a family, it may be friends, it may be a spouse, that just are in the habit, consciously or not, of shaming us for whatever reason. And I think at some point, while we're trying to kind of get rid of the shame from ourselves and learn to stand up and not feel that, we may need to take a break from people who just can't resist, for whatever reason, shaming us. And I think because that's going to overwhelm our defenses in the beginning. So I think just really to reinforce, to avoid those shame reinforcers. And then a couple more, just in the act of kind of kindness, I think to really practice love and kindness toward other people, but especially toward ourselves. We are so hard on ourselves. And addicts, you know, have done plenty of crappy things, right? And we have to own what we've done. We have to take responsibility for that. We should feel remorse and sadness, but at some point we have to take our core, and believe that we did bad things, but we're good people, and that we have to really work on that and build on that, because I think that can really start to challenge us. And then finally, forgiveness. You know, this is a spiritual principle, I think, that really is useful in recovery in general. But I think if we can learn to feel good about ourselves and forgive whatever parts of us we felt have done bad things, and really start to make peace with that and integrate ourselves, not have a shame core over here and parts of ourselves that are trying to recover over here, but to really, as the name of our company says, seek integrity so that we become integrated, which is really the root of that word. We're integrated without that shame kind of interrupting us being a whole complete person. So I think that's it. I've talked a long time. I'll be quiet and we'll go on. Thank you.
Thanks, David. If you have questions about any aspect of addiction and recovery, especially anything to do with shame, type them into the Q&A feature. We'll get to them really quickly. The last point you made, David, was forgiveness, and you mentioned forgiveness of yourself. Do we also need to forgive the people who shamed us? Does that help with our shame?
I think that kind of forgiveness in general is, as I consider it a spiritual principle that has to be kind of running through our lives, both for ourselves and for other people. If we harbor resentments, if we harbor anger, that also, it's, I don't know on the toxicity scale if it's stronger than shame or not, but those kind of resentments are really damaging for us. So I think, yes, and I think there's a time for that. I think if we try to jump into that forgiveness place too soon, it's going to be artificial, or it's not going to be incomplete. I really look to the steps for guidance in terms of the timing of these things. And that then, the amend steps are what, 2/3 of the way through. And I think that's maybe when we start to need to consider how we think about other people. And for me, in my own life, I realized the people that shamed me, consciously or not, were people that were very wounded themselves. And once I sort of understood that and had compassion for them, it became easier at least to understand and to let go of the hurt and fear. So yes, absolutely.
Also, for me, it was easier to forgive myself once I was able to see that they were damaged people and to forgive them for shaming me. It was easier to accept that, oh, I'm damaged too, and to forgive myself.
Yeah, I think that's often the step that people follow. I think I talk a lot with my clients about kind of intergenerational wounding, right? So, and how the fact once we get into recovery, we have the opportunity to stop it, to stop giving this to our kids and passing it on. Because what I understood, probably longer into recovery than it should have taken me, was that, my father, who was a difficult person in my childhood, was very wounded himself. And I started to have compassion for him. And I realized he'd been wounded by his father. And God knows how far back in my family tree that goes. But I think once I kind of got that, it made it much easier to kind of make peace with the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the other points I wanted to bring up, shame, it fits so perfectly with addiction. It's there's no question it's the precursor to addiction. It's the engine. I don't think anybody who studies addiction would disagree with that, but it also teaches us, if I'm feeling shame about myself, I'm going to learn to keep secrets, and I'm going to learn to tell lies. And if I live in a family where my parents are both shame-based, as I did, they were very good at keeping secrets and telling lies. It was the perfect storm for not only becoming an addict, but also keeping it secret and hidden for a very long time. Shame is just feeds addiction on so many levels. So it's so important to overcome it, like we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, I often was surprised that I knew as a kid what secrets to keep. The fact that there was some alcohol in my house and not to invite my friends over to my house. We go to their house, that kind of stuff. And all that was just kind of automatic. I think secrets were part of that whole thing. So yeah, for sure.
I was working on, I'm developing a work group for porn addicts, male porn addicts, which is going to start up in the fall. And the class that I was preparing today was about guilt and shame. I've got guilt and shame on the mind, big time. Brene Brown, she said a lot of great things about shame. One of the things she said was we're not born with shame, and you mentioned this, we learn it from other people. But she's also said, and this was in a training that I was at of hers, she said, as I got older, I learned how to do it all by myself. I didn't need somebody else to shame me. I was good doing it all on my own. And I think as addicts and also partners of addicts, we get very good at doing shame all by ourselves. We don't need a whole lot of help with it.
For sure. That's true of any kind of negative messaging that we get as kids. We internalize it and carry it on. You know, my parents are both deceased, but it lives on within me if I'm not careful. So yeah, we gotta be careful.
Can you talk a little bit about where and how shame lives in the body? I know we need to identify our shame. For me, that started with body sensations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for bringing that up, because I always like to draw the connection between our experience of emotions as kind of intellectual concepts, and these thoughts and feelings we have, but really connected with body sensations. And for me, shame kind of lived down in my gut, kind of this pit of my stomach feeling. But I think very often, if we can identify those physical corollaries to the emotion, that can be a great indicator for us of what's going on, because we may not be able to identify it right off the top in terms of a thought or what is that, but we can feel it, and we can feel it physically. And by the way, it's also important to those physical sensations, for example, of shame, can be triggers to set off an addictive process, right? Because those are uncomfortable feelings we don't want to experience. I think probably a lot of us, shame was the impetus for trying to numb. That was the original thing we tried to numb, probably. And so I think when we feel those physical triggers of shame, it may indicate that that I'm in trouble, and I might want to respond to it in an old, unhealthy way. So yeah, I think recognizing those physical corollaries is really important.
You mentioned we need to do a lot of self-compassion and things like that. Do we also need to speak our shame? That's another Brene Brown phrase. I think we need to speak our shame. Does it lose power when we talk about it, particularly in the presence of others?
I mean, absolutely. That's probably every day in group, we bring that idea up, that if the more people can leave, with us at our residential treatment program, and the less baggage, emotional baggage they have to take home, the better they're going to feel. We know that really shame and secrets really wither with sunlight and truth. And so I think truth is the ideal kind of concept here to bring it out and to release it and give it away. And just the more we carry it, and everybody, it's almost it's routine when new clients come in to seek integrity. Part of our check-in process daily is some releasing of secrets, and a lot of people always say, well, this one I was going to take to my grave. I think we classify our secrets as terrible and really terrible, and oh my God, you're never going to hear this one. And those are the ones that I think we really do need to release, because that is such a drain on our emotional well-being. It's a real challenge.
And as long as we're keeping secrets, it doesn't matter what the addiction is. As long as we're keeping secrets, as long as we're letting our shame, live, it's like a mushroom. It loves the dark. Those dark, moist corners in the back of our mind, they just multiply, and it just grows and takes over until we bring it out into the sunlight. You used the term sunlight earlier. There's a great saying in AA: we're only as sick as our secrets. And I think that goes directly to shame. They're talking about behaviors, but they're also talking about shame.
Totally. Yeah, that's that inside job, right? We don't need people to give us mean looks or do anything. We can do it all by ourselves with all those internal thoughts and beliefs, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to take over, but I do have one more question, and then we'll get into the Q&A, and we've got a bunch already, so we'll go fairly quickly today. You said avoid your shame reinforcers. Okay, so your shame reinforcer is your mom or your dad, and you can't entirely avoid these people. How do you avoid a shame reinforcer while still having that person in your life? Because shaming parents continue to be shaming parents, at least in my experience.
Right. I think,
yeah.
I mean, there's a variety of things to do. I have recommended to clients sometimes that they take a break from their families, a physical break, not have contact for a period of time, in order. And by the way, that's not to punish or anything like that. It's to give the client time to kind of develop their own, to strengthen their self-concept. In other cases, I think it comes down to boundaries and boundaries about people, and letting them know, gee, when you say that, it makes me feel hurt, or it could be trigger shame, and shame is bad. I think just trying to educate people and let them know that when they say certain things, it has this effect. They may or may not be able to change, but I think then a boundary is all about protecting me. And so I may have a boundary of, well, if that conversation continues, I need to step away or take a break or leave or something like that. So I think every case is different, but I think it is important for us to be able to step out of the toxicity and then step back in as we can. But I think we need to have the power to kind of move closer or farther away to protect ourselves. And there are certain people, you're right, like parents who we probably don't want to remove from our lives, but we do need to figure out a way that we can have some control over or what's said and how we take it in. You're muted. You're muted.
I know I said I was done asking questions, but I have one more that arose from that one. It's a follow-up. I'm rationalizing, taking over the webinar here. Let's say you and I are siblings, and I'm the favorite son, and you're the black sheep, and you're the one who got shamed growing up, and I was the golden child who could do no wrong, and they used me to shame you, or whatever that the dynamic is. So we go home for a holiday, and I see our parents in the same pattern. They're shaming you. And what can I do as someone who sees shaming taking place that's not directed at me? Is there anything I can do? Should I do anything? Should I stay out of it? What is that dynamic like?
So we know from research, and it's pretty new research actually too, of the power of bystanders. And the research is mostly on witnessing violence or verbal abuse or racist comments or things like that. When bystanders speak up, it carries tremendous power and has a huge influence. And I think the same thing goes in the scenario you just suggested, where if a sibling can speak up and basically, say that's not okay and kind of correct it, I think it has great power for everybody. And I know it would be terribly meaningful to the family member that's been receiving the shame, for sure. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I think the longer we're silent and complicit with it, the whole system kind of rolls forward. And this is, families are systems, and it will, the impetus will be to kind of keep it all together. That's where secrets come in. They're just to keep the whole thing moving forward. But I think if any one member of that can speak up and change the dynamic, it will have, ramifications through the whole system. I think it's a good thing.
Thank you. Okay, let's get to the Q&A. What are your thoughts on 12-step groups, particularly SLA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, in which men and women are attending together?
Interesting. When it comes to treatment, I'm a really firm believer in gender-specific treatment for sex addiction, right? So you have groups of men, you have groups of women. I don't object to mixed gender 12-step groups. I think in that context, we're getting back into life. We talk about 12-step program being a bridge back to life. Is there the potential for being triggered? Yeah, sure. But it's also then an opportunity to learn how to manage it and deal with it, because we are going to live together in this world, right? We're going to encounter people, we're going to encounter attractive people. And I think at some point we have to learn how to deal with that and live together and live our lives in recovery in that context. But I think I have been and do go, in fact, to all male meetings, and not just gay meetings, and they're men's meetings, gay and straight. And I think there's a lot of benefit for that too. I like that a gender-specific meeting and kind of my diet of meetings for men's issues. But I think overall, at least personally, I don't think that's a problem. I know, Scott, you may have more experience with S programs. You do, by far, than me. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, let's talk about treatment for a second, because you and I both have treatment experience, and I'll just say my treatment experience. Men and women in a treatment setting together is a bad idea.
Yeah.
The straight guys are paying attention to the women are trying to show off. Nobody's paying attention to treatment. People are acting out. It's crazy. Interestingly, you put a bunch of gay men in a treatment center together, or gay men mixed with straight men, and they don't do it, which I find weird.
It's true.
Not that it never happens, but it pretty much doesn't happen. We've had, I think, one incident, since we've been open, and it was not really an incident. It was just somebody was behaving badly.
Yeah.
But when you put men and women in a treatment center together, it's a mess. So yeah, I'm in total agreement with that, and you can feel free to comment more on that if you want to. But as far as 12-step meetings, I'm a big fan of number one, mixture meetings up. So do some mixed group meetings, do multiple kinds of meetings, do SLAA and SAA, do a men's group or a women's group, depending on your gender, mix it up. I think women's groups are actually really important in 12-step recovery, because it gives the women a safe space where they can talk about women's issues. Men will pretty much talk about men's issues anywhere, I find. But I think women often need a safe space. And out here where I live, there's a lot of gay men. Women will often come to the gay meetings and say, can I come here? I just need a space where I can recover instead of being hit on. And I'm like, yeah, sit down, welcome.
Right.
But you need to find groups where you feel safe. That's the big thing. So that was kind of a rambling non-answer.
No, I think it's great. Good points. Good points.
Everyone is always saying if his lips are moving, he's lying. Is this forever or only if someone isn't in recovery? Good question.
Good question. I think basically we understand that addicts lie. I mean, it's kind of part of the terrain. And I think it becomes a habit. And for many addicts, it becomes second nature. We kind of almost joke sometimes about people lying about stuff that they don't have to lie about. It's like, why did you just say that? It's, there was no need to, but it's almost like this automatic response. I do think that gets better. I think certainly in recovery, everybody aspires to, honesty and integrity. I think sometimes, hopefully, it doesn't happen in a major way. There may be white lies. I don't know. I'm because it's such a slippery slope with myself, with my clients, we try to have 100% kind of pure standard with the understanding that it may happen. And then what we do is if it does happen, we talk about, okay, how fast do you correct it? And we put a time limit on, like within 24 hours at the latest, but the sooner the better. So I think ideally, lying stops. Realistically, it probably continues some, but I think you have every right to expect that it's going to improve significantly, and that if it should happen, you're going to hear about it quickly. It'll be corrected, and I think that is a realistic viewpoint and a fairly good one too. But I don't think we can assume people are going to just lie the rest of their lives through recovery. That really does undermine the integrity of recovery if people continue to do that. And so I think it's important to have that expectation that people are telling the truth and are held accountable for that.
Yeah, and this lying and secrets, we talked about it earlier, they come from shame. I'm ashamed of who I am and what I'm doing. So I'm gonna lie and keep secrets, or they also come from, I don't want you to scream at me or whatever it is I'm afraid of. But it's really all based in shame. As I work on my shame, my need to lie and keep secrets is going to be diminished. But it's also a tremendous habit. David, mentioned, people who lie and don't need to. I did that. Things would come out of my mouth, and when I finally started to work on my lying, which was really kind of my second year of recovery, not my first year. The first year I was just trying to make it through the day, and I was trying to quit everything, not just sexual problems, and I wasn't in a relationship, so the lying wasn't quite as damaging for me as it might be for somebody who's in a relationship. But it was kind of my second year of recovery where I really consciously worked on, I need to start telling the truth. And, I would catch myself all the time. Something would pop out of my mouth and I would have to just say, I'm sorry, that wasn't right. Here's the truth. I don't know why I said that. And I would be sharing in 12-step meetings, the one place where everybody ought to be able to be totally honest, or in therapy, the other place where everybody ought to be totally honest. And I would say something and I would be like, oh my God, that's not true. just immediately. I would catch it immediately. But it was such an ingrained habit, trying to make myself look and sound better than I was, and sometimes just for no reason at all. It was just a habit. So it took a while. Rigorous honesty is not a switch that you can flip on and off. If you're an habitual liar, and addicts are habitual liars, it's work. You have to practice telling the truth, telling it faster, coming clean after you tell a lie, fessing up to your secrets, all of that stuff.
And Scott, I just want to underscore something you just said, because it's so important, and that this lying behavior is not necessarily, it does speak to some extent about the character of the person, but it's not about just being a sociopath. It's about coming right out of these wounds, right? And I can think of a case, and I do it myself because I have still these vestiges of feeling like unworthy. So, what score did you get on the test? Well, maybe I got a 94, but I'll say 96. Just why? But just because.
Or say 85 for no reason.
Yeah. So it's like, I think it's just happening, but it stems directly out of our own shame and our own fear of not being good enough, not being worthy, all that stuff. So I think if we understand the lies in the context of that, I think it does help explain why they persist to some extent until we get further along into recovery.
Yeah, but you had kind of mentioned earlier, it's tough for us to take compliments. When you said you get a 94 and say you got a 96, my thought was I would literally say I got an 85. That's the direction my lie would go on something like that, because I feel like a fraud, and I don't want to, if I say I got a 94, you're going to think I'm lying. That's how my brain works. Even now, I have to fight that instinct.
Yeah.
So
I get it.
Yeah, it's shame is a weird thing. A lovely note, telling us thank you, Mom. Any suggestions on how to practice love and kindness toward ourselves? David, are you there? There you are.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. Yeah, love and kindness toward ourselves. I think that's a real challenge. I mean, it's easier said than done, right? Because we, as I mentioned before, we have to sort of start doing the behaviors before we may believe it totally. But I think for me, the only way, the access point that I was able to do that was to separate out this younger. I could have empathy for the younger version of me that had the original hurt and felt that shame, and who had no resources and nobody in his life that was there for him. And I have empathy for that younger version of me. And that was really the doorway that allowed me to start to feel compassion for my whole self. And because otherwise I couldn't do it. I practiced that observer self. I tried in every way, but I really needed to find something to grab onto, and then it spread. And then it gradually started to work its way through my whole being. But I think just to be gentle, to be consistent. This is not something that, remember, we have been programmed, like little robots programmed with all this kind of negative stuff for years. And it takes time to reverse that. We're basically reprogramming how we think about things. And that's not just, it's like an affirmation. It's not just a one-shot deal. It takes repetition, it takes time, it takes patience. And I think it takes sincere dialogue. I had a dialogue with that part. I dialogue with that wounded part of myself. Just I had it, talking back and forth. But I think just any technique you can do like that, to some way to make it relevant and meaningful and accessible. I think that's the way to do it. And also be really careful, because I found even in my kind of loving dialogue with my younger self, real critical stuff would, some of those old negative beliefs kind of would come right in. It's like, wow, where'd that come from? But I was able to correct it. But I started to understand how pervasive some of these negative beliefs were in my belief system, and they would just appear there. And I really had to consciously it's like pulling weeds to really pull those out of my consciousness and correct them. But I would just say, be gentle and be patient and be consistent. I think those three things, and you'll get some results.
Yeah, you mentioned being patient, and earlier you said, acting as if is sometimes necessary. This is one where this is not going to happen overnight. Shame does not go away immediately. Bring the feet, the mind will follow. When the mind catches up, then we work on transferring it down into the heart.
Yeah.
It's a 3-step process, and for me, it was a process of doing affirmations and going to therapy and reality checking and doing all the things that David talked about earlier in terms of overcoming shame. But I had to just do the work, even though it really wasn't sinking in for a while, but just repeatedly doing the work and sitting in 12-step meetings and watching other people get better and thinking, oh, well, if they can get better, maybe I can, all of this stuff. And eventually my mind caught up. And a couple of years later, a couple of years later, my heart caught up. And I no longer feel like a defective person. I no longer feel like damaged goods. I'm not perfect. I make a lot of mistakes, but I don't feel like I'm damaged goods anymore. And what a nice feeling.
And Scott, that's so important what you just said, because shame, all that stuff lives up here. These are the beliefs about ourselves and old thoughts and it all is up. It's a head game. And I think, and we talk about this with our clients too, if we can move from up here and connect this to our hearts, right? And start to speak and live from our heart center, I think that's when, I guess, as you said it, and I hadn't really thought about it in these terms, but as I was able to connect with a lot of therapy and some years in program, start to connect with my own heart, that's when the forgiveness and all of that compassion really started to flow, because I wasn't trying to figure it out and change it up here as an intellectual exercise. I was feeling it. I think that's a huge distinction. Thanks for helping me clarify that. That's really
and the shitty committee up here wants to control everything, and the heart kind of wants to be sometimes, and it's a very different space to live in.
Yep, absolutely.
So in past webinars, we've talked about the damage of objectification in sex addiction. How can I learn to move away from this? Excellent question.
Yeah, so, objectification literally is when we convert human beings into sexual objects as opposed to people. And it's something that happens quite automatically with addictions, especially the intensity addictions like porn, sex, and chemsex. And it gets so bad, for example, with amphetamines and methamphetamine, that there's been tests where people can't even understand what facial expression someone is portraying when they smile or when they frown. It just all looks kind of like anger to somebody on methamphetamine. So we start to really, with the objectification and the process, the addictive process, it really starts to interfere with our ability to connect with people in a very important human way. And humans, and this is very exciting actually, neurological research about the past 10 years or so, we've started to discover what we're calling the empathy circuit. And now I think so far there's about 11 different discrete areas of the brain that are wired with this dedicated circuitry that is all about empathy. And we don't really understand it totally, but we have these mirror neurons that we've talked about before that help us. They're kind of sort of the hardware that help us really understand and identify with what somebody is not only saying, but what they're feeling. So if my friend Scott is really in pain and we're talking, I can start to feel the pain he's feeling. That's that empathic connection. Objectification is like the polar opposite of that. It takes all that away. We see people as objects, basically for our convenience and our use, for our satisfaction, our sexual satisfaction. And it's a very, of course, damaging place to be, of course. And so to move away from it, we have different techniques. Right in the moment, we talk about the 3-second rule, where if we see somebody we're attracted to, we break the contact, we break the eye contact and look away and remind ourselves, we kind of rehumanize that person. Or they're someone's daughter or mother or brother or son or whatever it is, to kind of re-emphasize who they are. And I think that's just getting that mindset starts to really, really help. But I think practicing empathy is something that's really, really important. I think empathy is like a muscle, like a skill that we can strengthen. And I think it takes being relatively in a quiet place yourself, being in a compassionate place, and really listening and observing and really trying to connect. And I think we all have it. It's like a gift that we're born with. I think we kind of unlearn it through the process of addiction. So it's something that can be reacquired, but it takes some work for sure. But I think just really trying, really connecting, really listening to what people are saying. So many of us, if you think about your interactions, we are formulating a response. This is especially true with spouses or partners. If they're saying something to us, we're already, responding or creating our rebuttal before they're even done. And so just slowing down that communication, really listening. There's a great technique in couples therapy that I like to actually use sometimes by repeating what the person just said before you respond. And that just slows it down and starts to build this connection that's not just words, but starts feelings and identification back and forth. So it's just a practice. It's a practice.
Yeah, and just in terms of like in the moment when you're objectifying, we were talking about this in my meeting earlier, in my support group earlier. Somebody had gone on a hike, and there was this was a straight guy, and there were some women who were wearing less clothing than most hikers wear. And he said he was triggered by that, but he looked away, and he practiced the 3-second rule, which is a great tool. Once you realize you're objectifying, give yourself 3 seconds to turn away and think about something else. But he found that, he had freeze framed those images and kind of stored them away. And I laughed and said, yeah, I'm very good at that. I can look away, but I can store the image of whatever it is I saw. And then I can make a whole 2-hour feature film about it later,
right.
In which, we meet, we have great sex, we get married, we have some more great sex, then we fight, we get a divorce. I've done that, in my head, I've been, married 40,000 times, because, sex addiction is a fantasy addiction. So in addition to the 3-second rule and turning away, we also need to not play out the fantasy later. We need to not bring it back up. So, rubber banding, you have a rubber band on your wrist, snap it against your wrist to break your thoughts. But the big thing we need to do is, we have circle plans for sex addicts for a reason. Inner circle, bottom line, problem behaviors. Middle circle, slippery behaviors. Outer circle, healthy things we can do other than acting out or fantasizing about acting out. David has said before, if I tell you don't think about the elephant in the room, or don't think about the color red, you're immediately going to think about the elephant or color red or whatever. If you tell me what I can't do, I that's all I can think about.
Right.
But if you give me something else to do,
right.
I'm great. I'm good. And the guy who was sharing earlier, he had been triggered and he had something else to do, which was hiking with friends. He was good. But later, when he didn't have something to do, the image came back, the trigger came back, the objectification came back, and he wanted to make his little movie. And he had to turn to his outer circle to prevent himself from objectifying in this fantasy later. So it's an awareness of the fact that you're doing it, and then intervening, and then doing empathy work and other kinds of work like David talked about on a much bigger scale. But in the moment, you've got to stop doing it. You got to catch yourself and intervene. So yeah.
Great.
Is compartmentalizing one's acting out a way of trying to avoid shame?
Yeah, I mean, compartmentalizing is a very effective way to just shut off all kinds of stuff. And, when we act out, and of course that always, if we look at the addiction cycle, it does include, a period afterwards of remorse and shame and guilt and all that stuff that we feel terrible about ourselves for. And it's very useful to kind of be able to just shut that all off and disconnect from it. Because that's really what the whole act of addiction is all about too, is disconnecting from those feelings, tucking them in that little bank vault over there and forgetting about them. So yes, and what's, I think, striking for people, and I see this dramatically in treatment, with people that are in residential treatment, that when that wall of compartmentalization and kind of denial shatters, and they start to reconnect with the feelings of the impact they've had on their loved ones or their family, or just they start to just reconnect with that. Some of it's shame, some of it's sadness, a lot of feelings just come welling in. And then I realized how effective those compartment walls are at keeping, at really, they're watertight in terms of keeping out feelings, right? And so, and to our detriment in recovery. And so we really need to learn how to kind of break down those walls and start to feel. But you're absolutely right. Compartmentalizing is a way to just disconnect. You know, okay, I'm going to step over into this life, this world, this zone, and it's totally detached from that. I'm not feeling. I'm aware of what I'm doing and how it's impacting my partner, but I'm not in touch with the feelings that's going on. And that's what happens, I think, in early recovery. And that's just an essential process to kind of reconnect, I think.
Yeah. This next one, it's a long question, but I'm going to read the whole thing because I think I need to. I am the betrayed partner of a sex addict in recovery who is struggling with his emotional regulation. My partner is a mother enmeshed man. The mother is definitely a shame reinforcer toward both of us, and he was abandoned by his father. I don't think he trusts anybody, including me, despite having no reason to not trust me. We've tried to set healthy boundaries by seeing his mother less, but every time we do, my partner is full of aggression for days afterward, and it's always directed at me. How do I bring up that I feel unsafe when he is in this state, and how do I separate his mother from me in his mind? How can I encourage my partner to get out of his shame in a kind way without triggering him? And then she adds that he often acts out around the times when they see his mother.
Not surprised. Those kind of events are very triggering and are really kind of an essential part of our addictive cycle sometimes. So yeah, a lot of questions in here. Good questions. Good awareness in here. I think a couple of things. This kind of situation, you might do really well with a couples therapist who could walk you guys through this dynamic and help with not only the direct behavior, for example, aggression directed at you, irritability, whatever, and also I help highlight some of the internal stuff that's going on. What is the feeling? Because very often when we're in that shame spiral we're kind of flailing and directing it inappropriately at other people, we're really kind of out of touch with our observer self that I mentioned before, that part of us that can kind of see the whole pattern. And sometimes having an objective person, not you, but a third person, point it out can be really more effective. And I've often found when I do couples work that I can say the exact same thing a partner might have said, but somehow the person can hear it when it comes from me as opposed to the partner. So I think just that dynamic might help there. I do think healthy boundaries are really important, but I think it's going to be really essential for you to share your feelings, that feeling unsafe, especially and I think that's, as I said, probably best done in the context of couples therapy. Now, there's some really good literature out there on mother enmeshment. There's some really good workshops on mother enmeshment, like weekend workshops on that. Ken Adams in Detroit does some. He also has a couple books out. Scott, I don't know if you could put those in the.
Yeah, I'm working on that right now.
Okay, perfect. Because that's a thing that can be worked on and fixed. So I think these old dynamics are important. And I think, sometimes, and I've seen this in myself sometimes, we get locked in, even though I know, for example, a trip to my, parental home when they were alive would result in those same kind of feelings. And when I went with my partner, he'd said, "My God, you're acting like you're 12." I actually regressed. And I think we do regress. We become those younger versions of ourselves in our partner's homes, the parental homes. But I think just having that awareness and tools when you're going through it is going to be really helpful. So,
yeah. There's a video, John Taylor did a webinar about mother enmeshed men, which I spelled wrong. My apologies, but I put the link to that video, and then Adam's books are Silently Seduced and When He's Married to Mom. all awesome. And John Taylor is a facilitator of Ken Adams workshops. He's the Ken Adams or John Taylor. Those are the only two people
Exactly.
those mother enmeshed men workshops.
Yep.
Does shame have anything to do with self-pity? I recognize when I feel self-pity more, but don't realize when I'm shaming myself. I like the idea of feeling shame in the pit of my stomach and telling my secrets. I also notice the more honest I am with others and they accept me, the more I feel I can accept myself as I am. I tell people things I have a hard time accepting too, but how often do I tell people these secrets without feeling I'm dragging them down? I find calling someone once a week may be too much and might need to call certain people every other week so I don't burden them.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, the shame and self-pity, I think, yeah, they're kind of all wrapped up together, for sure. I think we can drop into kind of our victim, which is another word that goes in the same kind of family of things. I think self-pity, victim, shame, all the same thing. And what we kind of see sometimes is kind of a reverse, I'll call it reverse narcissism, where it's like, oh my God, I am the worst person in the world. You know, nobody's done things as bad as I have. All that stuff. We're like, we kind of, there's this like weird pride in like how bad we are. Sometimes my friend and our colleague Karen talks that junkie pride. You know, it's like, oh my God, I'm so bad. I'm so much worse than you are. And we see this in drugs too. You know, well, you do cocaine. Well, I did meth. Well, I shot meth. You just smoked meth. It's like, okay, guys, stop. So there is that. And I like what you're saying about just accepting yourself as you are based on the feedback of other people. What I do want to say though is that, you know, and I identify with this too, because I believed that I was such damaged goods that if I started to talk and call people in my recovery groups for help or for assistance or just to make a connection, I was probably going to be burdening them. And part of that was like, oh my God, I'm the worst person ever. And part of it was just not understanding the dynamic. And first of all, for anybody, if you're in recovery, I think it's really important to get in the habit of making calls regularly, including days when you're just great, when you're feeling great, because it's so much easier once you have a crappy day, if you're in the habit of calling someone already, than picking up the phone and someone you've never talked to before and laying it all out, right? It's not going to be very easy or productive. The other thing I've learned is that because now I've been on the recipient of some of those calls too, it feels really good to get those calls and to be able to be helpful. And I think Scott mentioned the very useful tool earlier of reality checking, reality testing. Next time you feel that way, ask them, okay, I'm just curious, what was this like for you? I feel so bad to have burdened you. Ask them and see what they say. And I think you're going to be surprised. And there's a great slogan in AA that somehow I missed. I just sort of recently, but it's around everywhere now. It's like, one call saves 2 lives. And that one call that you make is not only going to help you, it's going to help the person you call. And I really challenge you to test that in reality, and you'll find it's true. So don't think that your problems are so. Sometimes in group, by the way, when we talk about like releasing secrets or something, and somebody think, my God, this is what I'm carrying to my grave, and they'll say it, and it's like, waiting for the earth to stop, and everybody's like, yeah, I did that, or okay, it's like, no, next, and so that kind of experience too is like important to put everything in perspective, that we're not such terrible people, and we're not unique. I guess that's the other thing.
I have a batch of AA friends that I'm really close to, and about a couple years into the friendship, I realized they don't know everything about me. I need to sit down and basically do a 5th step with them. We happened to all be together as a group. I said, guys, there's some stuff I'd like to share with you. And so I unburdened all of my secrets. And they all looked at me and said, thanks for sharing that. Should we go to lunch now? It was just like, okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. And at lunch, everybody was like, oh, I did that too. Oh yeah. So this question, I just want you to know, I identify with everything you said. When I got into recovery, I thought I was the worst person ever, and nobody would possibly want me to call them once, let alone once a week. Oh my God. They would change their number and, light their hair on fire or something so they didn't have to talk to me. That's what I thought. And some of the advice I got was call people when you're feeling good, as David said, and only ask about them. Don't even talk about yourself. How you doing? Where did you grow up? I'm just curious. Just show an interest in them. Don't talk about yourself at all. And then when you call and you do need to, spew, they're willing to listen. And, you feel like you've listened to them. I don't know. It was like a quid pro quo thing that made sense to me. And even though it didn't have anything to do with reality, they didn't need a quid pro quo. I was so ashamed that I needed to feel like I was giving them something before I could call them. So try but pick up the phone, call people. Yeah, I'm with you. I was that deeply shamed. So yeah, I feel your pain. I do. Oh.
Yeah.
Can we squeeze in one more, David?
Sure.
Okay. How can an addict get over the belief that they will never be good enough, especially when they use this as a reason not to move forward in repairing the harm they have done in their relationship? For example, avoiding collaborative transparency and continuing unhealthy coping mechanisms like defensiveness, rather than participating openly with good faith check-ins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how can an addict get over this belief, especially when he or she is using it as a roadblock to recovery?
Yeah, so there's a very cool term that therapists throw around called secondary gains. And secondary gains are just that. They're things, they're benefits that we get. So I may be sitting around believing that I'm the worst person in the world, and that's a painful place to be in. It keeps my addiction going, and it kind of feeds all the negative elements in my life. But why would I take that? Well, it maybe I get some sympathy from some people for it. Maybe it works in some other ways. Maybe there's some benefit. So I think the secondary gain is like this indirect way that this behavior is kind of feeding itself and locked into my world. And I think we have to understand those secondary gains. What are you getting from that? And at first that seems like a crazy question, but I'd really seriously consider it. What's the payoff in doing this, in keeping this behavior? When you have choices now, you can change. So what's keeping you locked into that? I would really take a serious look at that. And I think once you find out what those secondary gains are, it'll be much easier to kind of release that behavior and change.
David, there's one question left. Do you mind?
No, sure.
Okay. I'm a chemsex addict who is now sober from meth for 3 months and porn for 30 days.
Good for you.
I'm also on SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and for anxiety and depression, which is helping but not enough. Do people with prior drug use have difficulty helping with medications for anxiety and depressions? Is their tolerance higher?
It's really an individual thing, depending on your circumstance. Some people have more depression than others. Oftentimes I see that meth, because it is such a great antidepressant at first, although it doesn't end that way, but people do a lot of times people that are drawn to meth do have some more depression than normal. So it could be that. I would talk to whoever's prescribing it. You may just, not every SSRI works for everybody, and a lot of times it's trial and error. So you may just need a different one as opposed to more of something. And
SSRIs don't fix everything. They help with anxiety, depression. They don't necessarily make those things completely go away.
Yeah.
So don't expect too much from a psych.
And by the way, we know from the medical literature that research shows that medication plus therapy is the best combination for good outcome.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Great questions today.
For sure.
Finish. Great stuff. David, great topic. We will be back next week. We will see you all then.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, David.
Now just get rid of that shame. It's not doing you any good.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.